Today we're going to continue our study by focusing on metaphysical possibility, some of the issues that come up in connection with logical possibility and metaphysical possibility, and also introduce some new terminology. So our goals for this lesson are twofold. So first, what we want to do is grasp the difference between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility. So we want to understand what it is to say that a sentence may be logically possible, but express a metaphysical impossibility. Our second goal is to learn important terminology that will aid our discussion of the a priori challenges to theism. So remember last time we looked at the Humean challenge about religious belief, and we looked at the verificationist challenge about religious belief, and we talked a bit about J.L. Mackey's idea that theism is incoherent in virtue of these conceptual issues that arise. So we want to begin with some background, and we'll start with three distinctions that are normally located in Hume. So the first distinction is one having to do with meaning, and it says that every declarative sentence is either analytic or synthetic. So a sentence is analytic if and only if the predicate term is contained within the subject term. So for example, we have the sentence, a green bonnet is a bonnet. And it's easy to see here that the predicate term bonnet is contained within the subject term, a green bonnet. But the sentence, a green bonnet is expensive, the predicate term is not contained within the subject term. So the first sentence, a green bonnet is a bonnet, is an analytic sentence. And the second sentence, a green bonnet is expensive, is a synthetic sentence. The second distinction that comes from Hume is this idea that every declarative sentence, every sentence that states a fact, that every sentence that states that something is the case, is either a priori or a posteriori. A priori has to do with how you can come to know that a certain claim is true. And the thought here is that if a claim is known a priori, then it's known by ideal reasoning. You don't need to go out into the world and investigate. A claim is a posteriori if it's known in virtue of one's engagement with the world. So the classic example is using your senses to discover whether a claim is true. So if you want to know, for example, whether the third note in the Star-Spangled Banner is lower or higher or the same as the first note, you have to actually become acquainted with the tune. The third distinction has to do with modality. In general, the mode of a sentence is the way in which it can be true. So when we talk about modality, we're talking about ways in which a sentence can be true. And the claim here is that every declarative sentence is either necessary or contingent. Now, a sentence is necessary if it's necessarily true or if it's necessarily false. And it's contingent if it's true in some cases and false in some other cases. Three distinctions are identified by Hume and some of his later successors. And so the idea is that their sentences are claims or statements of type 1, and their claims or statements of type 2. So every declarative sentence, right, is either a type 1 sentence or a type 2 sentence. If it's a type 1 sentence, then it's analytic. The predicate term is contained within the subject term. It's known a priori just in virtue of reasoning about the terms by substituting equivalent terms for it. You can turn it into something that you can know is true just by virtue of reasoning, and it's necessary. So the idea is that every necessary truth is a priori. So necessary truths, you don't need to go out and investigate the world to discover whether or not they're true. You can just think about them and discover whether they're necessarily true or necessarily false. Moreover, every necessary truth is analytic. So it should be, when you come across a necessary truth, that somehow or another, by substituting in various co-referring terms in subject and predicate position, it will be the case that the predicate term is contained within the subject term. And every a priori truth is necessary and analytic. So these three categories completely overlap. One of the ambitions that Hume and others had here is to take the analytic statements as being the explanatory base to explain how we can know certain truths, or to explain how certain claims are necessarily true. The idea here is that you didn't need to have some sort of special faculty of rational insight that somehow or another could reach out and figure out substantive truths about the world without any sense experience, and you could discover what's necessary or what's not just in virtue of ideal reasoning, because that would require some sort of special faculty. The idea is that we can explain how knowledge without sense experience is possible, or how certain claims are necessarily true just in virtue of linguistic facts about the meanings of certain terms. So the thought is that the analytic truths somehow or another are closer to home, that they provide an adequate explanatory base for philosophical reconstruction of the a priori and the necessary. Type 2 claims, these are substantive claims about the world. They're synthetic claims where the predicate term is not contained within the subject term. They're claims that are known a posteriori, so you have to go out and actually observe to see what the world is like, and they're contingent, so they can be true in some worlds and false in some other worlds. Again, the idea is that you can take any one of these, right? So if a claim is contingent, then the idea is that you know it can't be true in virtue of meaning alone. Again, if you know a claim a posteriori, then the idea is that it must be synthetic and that it must be contingent. And as before, the explanatory base, what you're doing is when you're explaining why a claim is a posteriori, saying there's no linguistic facts that make that claim true, that you need to go out and observe the way the world is to see if the predicate term is correctly predicated of the subject term. So the idea that every statement is either type 1 or type 2 is something that comes under critical scrutiny in a very influential series of lectures that Saul Kripke gave at Princeton University in 1970, and which were then published in his book, Naming and Necessity. Okay, so let's begin with some terminology. Let's introduce talk of possible worlds. So there is our world with its various mundane and surprising facts. But in addition to the way our world is, there's a way our world could have been, but it isn't. Hillary Clinton could have been president if the votes turned out differently, if she would have spent some more time in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. She could easily have been president, but she isn't. And so we want to make sense of the idea that to say that Hillary could have been president is to speak the truth. And we want to know, well, what makes that claim true? So talk of possible worlds are introduced as a way of providing truth makers for these kinds of statements about the way things could have been, but are not. So a possible world is a maximal and consistent set of claims reflecting a way a world could be. They have to be maximal, so it fills out an entire way the world could be. And it's consistent, so the claims can't conflict with one another. And this reflects the fact that contradictions can't be true. So given the talk of possible worlds, we can say that there's some claims that regardless of how the world turns out, they're always going to be true. So these claims are true in every possible world. We call these the necessary truths. Some claims are false in every possible world. No matter how the world could turn out, these claims just continue to be false. These are necessary falsehoods. And then there are claims that are true in only some worlds. So there's some worlds where they're true, and then there's some worlds where they're false. These claims are the contingent truths, or we might say the merely logically possible truths. Of course, necessary truths are also logically possible, so you have to be careful not to confuse contingent with logically possible for that reason. Okay, so now let's turn to logical and metaphysical possibility. Now, I want to say at the outset that talk of logical possibility is used in a lot of different senses, but talk of metaphysical possibility mainly is rooted in Kripke's work in Naming and Necessity. So let's say that a sentence is logically impossible if and only if it entails a contradiction. So here, logical possibility is a property of a sentence, and it has a syntactic definition. So it doesn't require any sort of special insight to tell whether a sentence is logically impossible or not. It's something that you could write a computer program to recognize. A contradiction is a sentence that's of the form A and not A, so it has a syntactic characterization. You have a sentence, a conjunction, a negation, and that same sentence. And then it would follow from the definition that a sentence is logically possible if and only if it doesn't entail a contradiction. Then we can characterize the notion of metaphysical possibility in this way. We can say that a sentence expresses a metaphysical possibility if and only if the proposition it expresses is true in some world. So here we want to distinguish between a sentence and the proposition or the thought that it expresses. So you could say the sun is yellow in a variety of different languages. In those different languages, sentences that express the sun is yellow, of course, express the same proposition. So let's note here that the form of a sentence can't tell us whether it's metaphysically possible or not, because we have to think about what the sentence is expressing and whether that thought is true in some world or other. Now, to determine whether a sentence is metaphysically possible, then we need to consider the entire way things could have been. So we need to consider a maximally consistent set of claims and determine whether there's some maximally consistent set of claims in which we find the thought expressed by this sentence. So that can be rather difficult, but one of the things that Swinburne wants to do in this chapter is to develop a tie between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility so that you can have good evidence that something is indeed metaphysically possible. So let's move on to some of the terminology that Swinburne uses in this book. We'll begin with the notion of a rigid designator. This is a term that comes from Kripke and Naming and Necessity. So this is fairly standard. So a rigid designator is a word or longer expression that refers to the same object in every possible world in which it exists. This is a bit different from the way Swinburne characterizes it, but this is a more standard characterization. So the word Aristotle is a proper name, and it rigidly designates Aristotle. It picks out the person who, in this world, was the famous student of Plato, even though in other worlds, Aristotle may not be Plato's student. So the idea is that it designates a single person, and that person it designates is held fixed regardless of what properties that person may not have. These properties are non-essential properties because if you change essential properties of a thing, then it no longer is that thing. So for example, if you consider a world that has a dog and it's named Aristotle, and you ask, well, is this Aristotle in this world? You say no, because it's an essential property of Aristotle that he's human, but it's not an essential property of Aristotle that he's a student of Plato. The word green is a rigid designator. It picks out the color that people normally see when looking at well-maintained grass at a local golf course. So let's look at a first application of rigid designators. So consider the sentence that water is not H2O. Water is a rigid designator. It denotes the substance, whatever it is, that is the actual transparent drinkable liquid that fills rivers and lakes. Now it's better to take this example of the use of water before the chemical revolution, so that we use the term water to designate this substance that we don't know what the underlying nature of this substance is, but it's all around us. So the sentence water is not H2O is logically possible. The sentence doesn't have the form of contradiction, but the sentence is metaphysically impossible. And what makes it metaphysically impossible is the actual referent of the word water. So the substance that is the actual transparent drinkable liquid that fills rivers and lakes is H2O. And so when we think about the thought that is expressed here, we think about the actual referent of water, and then we're saying whatever that is, it's not H2O. And in virtue of the fact that it refers to H2O, this would amount to the claim that H2O is not H2O, which is impossible. So we have here an example of where logical possibility, this property that attaches to sentences, can come apart from metaphysical possibility, which attaches to propositions, claims, or thoughts. So let's look at a second application of rigid designators. So we have certain identity statements that are informative. Hesperus was introduced to pick out the evening star. On the slide, the top picture is a picture of the evening star. So if you look closely, you can see it at the very top. Phosphorus was used to pick out the morning star, which in the bottom picture you can see at the top. When those terms were introduced, it was unknown that the brightest star in the sky that appeared in the evening was the very same heavenly body as the brightest object that appeared in the morning sky. They both refer to the planet Venus. Hesperus and phosphorus rigidly designate the same object. It was unknown what that object was, but it was found through astronomical investigation that it's the very same object. It's Venus. So this is an example of a statement that is metaphysically necessary and known a posteriori, even though its negation is logically possible. So the statement Hesperus is not phosphorus doesn't entail a contradiction. So Swinburne then introduces two other terms. He introduces the notion of an informative designator and an uninformative designator. So he says that an informative designator applies to things in virtue of their observable or experiential essential characteristics, or is defined in terms of such characteristics. In this case, there's no underlying essence to such things that determines whether the term is correctly applied. So take shiny and red, for example. They are informative designators, so whether a thing is shiny or not just depends on its superficial characteristics. Moreover, whether a thing is red or not depends on the way it is experienced by typical observers. So there's no hidden essence under red things that would determine whether or not it's correctly applied. If you have an object that under normal conditions for normal observers appears red, then it's red. There's no way it could turn out to be a different color, for example. Similarly with shiny. An uninformative designator, by contrast, applies to things in virtue of an underlying essence that we may not have knowledge of. So we saw this in the case of water, as it's used by people prior to the chemical revolution. They're picking out a substance that is clear, drinkable, fills lakes and rivers and so on, but they don't know what that substance is. Similarly, the word apple is an uninformative designator. So whether or not something is an apple, right, isn't determined just by its superficial characteristics or its observable characteristics. It could be a plum that looks a lot like an apple. It could be a fake apple. It could be just apple skin with no apple core. And there are, a number of possibilities you can think of where something that has the superficial characteristics of an apple is not an actual apple. Okay, so Swinburne spends all that time setting up the terminology and the discussion to connect conceivability, logical possibility, and metaphysical possibility. So up here we have a picture of Richard. This is Richard in his study. So a sentence is conceivable when it doesn't imply a contradiction. In that case, it's logically possible. The proposition expressed by a sentence is conceivable when it appears to be metaphysically possible. So we have conceivability as a property of a sentence, and we have conceivability as a property of a proposition. So how do we get evidence that a thought or a proposition is genuinely metaphysically possible? If a sentence doesn't imply a contradiction and it appears to be part of a maximally consistent set of claims, then we have evidence that it's metaphysically possible. So here's the way Swinburne puts all this together. So this is on page 52. If a sentence uses only informative designators, recall these are designators that apply to things in virtue of their observable characteristics or they're defined in terms of the observable characteristics, we should then be able to determine by mere reflection, so we don't have to do any empirical investigation, whether it or its negation is conceivable. So let's read that one more time. If a sentence uses only informative designators, we should be able to determine by mere reflection whether it or its negation is conceivable. It therefore follows that a sentence is metaphysically necessary, if and only if it's logically necessary, when we substitute co-referring informative designators for uninformative designators. So the idea is that we take a sentence like water is not H2O, and then we substitute in for the uninformative designator water an informative designator. So the informative designator is H2O, and then the sentence would say H2O is not H2O, which we know is logically necessary and hence metaphysically necessary. So the way this is going to work for Swinburne's view is that we're going to take certain statements in theology and we're going to substitute uninformative designators in for informative designators, and then we'll be able to use reflection to determine whether or not these claims are logically necessary, logically impossible, or logically possible. So that's the direction we're going to go. So next up, we're going to talk about words of theology. We're going to begin to get into the philosophy of religion.